In this lecture, we're going to learn about conditionals. A conditional, also known as an if statement, lets you choose which lines of code execute. We'll talk about why you might want to use conditionals, and then we'll explain how to write them. Then we'll go through some examples and explain why they work. After watching this lecture, you will be prepared to watch the rock, paper, scissors lecture, and then start the homework. A conditional statement allows our code to do different things, depending on whether a condition was true or false. This is probably the most useful statement we can write. If we didn't have conditionals, then our code would do the same thing every time we ran it. That wouldn't be a very useful program. For example, what if your email provider always let you log into your email, regardless of what password you entered? Conditional statements allow our program to give the correct answer, even when the input changes. For example, imagine we are trying to determine whether it is hot outside. If it's warmer than 95 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll say it's hot. An if statement is the right choice for this code because we only want to say it's hot if the temperature is greater than 95. Currently, we have defined the temperature to be 72. We know that 72 is not greater than 95, so this test will fail. When a test fails, its body will not execute, so this code won't print anything. Remember, that's what we want. Notice that the body is always indented one level deeper than the test, and that there is a colon after the test. What happens if we set the temperature to 100? Then, the first test passes because 100 is greater than 95. This causes the code in the body to execute, and Python prints hot. Let's try these two examples in code. If we let the temperature be 72, then it doesn't print anything. If we change the temperature to 100 and then run the code, then it prints hot. What if we want to classify other temperatures as well? To do this, we need to introduce two new conditional statements, elif and else. Let's start with elif. Elif is a combination of the words else and if. It means, if the first test failed, run this test. To see how it works, let's try an example. Here, the temperature is still 100. Just like before, the first if passes, so the body executes and the program prints hot. Now, does the second block execute? Remember, elif means, if the first test failed, run this test. Since the first test passed, we don't run the elif, and nothing else prints. What happens if we set the temperature to 72? Then the first test fails, so its body is not run. Since the first test failed, we run the elif test. We see that this test passes, so its body runs, and the program prints warm. Let's complete this program to round out the range of temperatures we might see. We have added a classification of cool between 45 degrees and 70 degrees. We have also added a new conditional, the else statement. The else statement means, if none of the ifs or elifs passed, then run the code in the else. Here, that means that if the temperature wasn't greater than 95, 70, or 45, we should print brrr. For example, the temperature is now 72, so what does our code print? We fail the first test, but we pass the second test. That means the body of the second test runs, but none of the other elif or else statements run. Our code prints warm, which is what we wanted. What happens if the temperature is 30? Then we fail all the if and elif statements, so none of their bodies execute. Since all of the tests failed, the else statement runs. It doesn't have a test. Instead, it prints brrr. Now, let's show some things that could go wrong when writing the temperature program. The code on the left is what we just wrote, and the code on the right is a similar program. However, what happens if you set the temperature to -10? Then, our program will print brrr. However, the program on the right will print hot. Notice it doesn't work for negative numbers. Let's look at another way to write this program that maybe doesn't work like we would want it to. Instead of writing a bunch of elif statements, we could have written 3 if statements. But what happens if the temperature is 100 degrees? The code on the right will pass all 3 tests and print 3 different statements about the temperature. That happens because the if statements are not mutually exclusive. If one passes, the rest still get tested. That was a lot of information, so let's do a quick recap of the important concepts. An if statement lets your program execute different code depending on whether a test passes or fails. The typical if statement has 1 or more blocks, and each if or elif has a test. Tests are executed sequentially until one of them passes. The code associated with that test will run, and no other tests will be performed. If no tests pass, then the optional else clause will execute. Remember that if tests are always run, while elif and else tests are only run if the previous tests failed. Take some time to review the slides on conditional statements, as well as practicing the examples in this video.